Okay, let's take a look at Holy Roman Empire. This is the old Wargamer game that I just played, but as I mentioned in the intro, and perhaps a number of times through the playthrough, it is under a Kickstarter campaign. I don't pay attention to whether it's completed or not, but I wanted to get this out because, well, One Small Step Games is putting it out. They put out a couple of interesting choices from my point of view with recent Kickstarter campaigns. This is one of them, and the other one was Al Nafi's Great War, which I also covered. That campaign's probably done, so it's either getting published or not. I think it made its goals. So the easiest thing to do is say, wow, the original version had some significant problems, and that's where, you know, the biggest criticism against it comes. And the thing is, all of those problems, many of those problems, can be cleared up in a reprint. Notably, there are counter screw-ups in terms of coloring, etc. The rules are a bloody mess. I know the designer says he's learned a lot since then and has done a better job on them. Some others, I found it difficult. Now, this may be more my table size than anything else, but just where, you know, say the Palatinate in Sweden had their conquest, influence, control markers, I ran into some serious problems with those kind of overlapping with each other. I ran into problems with the cards for the different nations. There's just so many of them that it becomes difficult to see who owns what and what status it's in. All information that you need to kind of be able to see at a glance. Now, that could be handled with a simple play aid, almost like, you know, if you had a whiteboard of all the nations up there, you could mark who owns what or whatever. That might work better. It's hard to tell. But I don't see a situation where that's going to be very easy to cope with. To see, hey, how big defensive force is there? You know, is there none? Is there an extra point there because there's a garrison? Whatever. But what about the game outside of these sort of, you know, first version problems? If I sort of picked the game and said, because I don't think that there's any huge structural changes to the game, if I picked up the new version and said, well, what would I expect to see in it? And what can we find wrong with that? Because it's always easier to find things wrong with the game than find things right with the game. Well, the core design of the game, it's a multiplayer game, so it's kind of a framework to hang this kind of diplomatic activity off of. It's not a very light framework. I played one recently that was very light and worked really well, and I can't remember what the hell it was. Oh, I don't know. But the framework's reasonably mellow. We're not talking about something like Europa Universalis here, which stops being a framework of a game to just hang diplomacy off of and becomes something really monstrously inglorious, complex. Instead, this is, you know, something that you could reasonably, if you were familiar with it or if the rules were a little better, teach to someone, to a group in less than an hour and be playing. Okay. So it starts off with a random events phase where you just roll up, see something kind of cool happens. We didn't get a lot of random events, actually, and I didn't pay too much attention to them. Most of them are pretty mellow. Some of them are kind of cool, though. I think there was one where it withdraws forces, right? Oh. Wow. So here's a neat one that we didn't get. Religious conversion. All cards in the control pile may be converted to the player's religion at a cost of 1 crown per. That would be kind of cool to have come up. Heresy. You get revolts. We didn't see any revolts happen. We have these foreign wars which would be specific. Some of them are very specific, like the Baltic War, which ends up knocking the Danes out of the game, which is pretty cool too. That was the only one that I saw that was really a very strictly historical event that had a huge effect. Finances, you end up counting up. Each of your cards has a value on it, and you end up counting up all those values, but it's modified by the status that it's in. So if you control it, you get full value. If you have influence, you only get half value, but otherwise you don't get anything. Now, some of the cards have this is part of that, there's some aspects of the mechanisms and design that I'm not sure are going to work any better in a new version. So for example, the cards have these symbols on them, quotes, parentheses, plus signs, which could be helpful in terms of a player aid, could make them more easy to absorb, rather than this densely packed rules that has, all the charts kind of included. All the play aid type information is just embedded in the rules, and there's no place where it's been extracted out. But all the same, you would still have to be aware of all of those and able to look them up as they happen, or as they affect you, essentially. So if you own Bavaria, you have to realize, oh, that's only half value because I'm not Bavaria, or whatever. So otherwise, though, you simply add them up, and that gives you a funding. But it's not quite that simple, because you have to find you have to find all the locations on the map that you control that have special circumstances under them. For example, if one of the provinces has been taken from a multi-province area, or if cities have been looted or taken or whatever, these things all cost you. So that's kind of painful. And there are ambiguities in the rules. So for example, do the Hanseatic cities count against the provinces that they're in, or are they just their own little thing? I don't know. Just a lot of stuff. Hopefully that'll be nailed down a little better. But I wouldn't guarantee it, because there's a lot of it. And it is kind of a game of a lot of these little special cases that it's very easy to screw something like that up. And it's not surprising that the initial set of rules were so troubled. You also have to pay a maintenance cost for all your units. Is sort of a bunch of exceptions to that again. Again, no matter what, I think the game is going to have rules by exception, where a number of countries have special rules, and you have to be aware of all of these, or else constantly be looking them up. And then you're allowed to upgrade your control level on things. And that's an expensive proposition if you're just going to lose the property. But here's the thing. If you end up not, increasing your from conquest to influence, or influence to, from conquest up to influence, and that's the expensive one, well, you have to maintain a garrison there all the time, and that has a cost of 1 per turn, plus a unit that you're not able to use somewhere, that opportunity cost. And if you don't upgrade it from influence to control, well, in some cases that can have additional effects beyond just the income that you'd receive. In the case of things like Saxony and Brandenburg, I believe control is necessary to use the troops. Then you have completely freewheeling alliance system. Once you lock it in for the turn, you can't attack that person, and those are the only people you can kind of cooperate with in any limited fashion. Okay, that's fine. At the end of that, though, you go to this the imperial phase, where if somebody has enough electoral crowns or can gather people with enough, they can get themselves declared Holy Roman Emperor. Otherwise, it stays in whoever's hands it's in. And then, if you have the empire, you can call a diet, I guess, to determine whether one of the particular issues that can be passed, and there's only a very limited number, will be passed. And they can have some pretty far-reaching effects. So there's kind of this interesting little multi-level mechanism as to what the diplomacy surrounds. You might be interested in electing someone Holy Roman Emperor because of what they can do for you there, but they're not bound by it in any sense. You know, we skipped something between the finances and the alliance declaration, which is the diplomatic bidding. Now, this is one of the most interesting facets of the game, because during finances, you also build your troops. Hey, that seems pretty normal. But your cash might be more valuable in just purchasing cards or putting bids on cards. And if you spend too much money on troops, people will be able to steal your properties. And if you don't spend much on troops, you have a big wad of money. You can either drain other people's treasury by forcing them to bid to hold on to troops or mercenary leaders, or you might be able to get things from them. And this creates this really hard struggle in your mind as to, is it better to use the money on troops, which can be very, very effective, or is it better to use the money on the diplomatic bids, which probably are less effective, although purchasing a mercenary if someone's foolish enough to have one. And that's one of the problems here with the design, to me, is that the mercenaries, especially of Wallenstein, are just not economical decisions generally. So that the struggle in your own mind as to whether or not to spend too much, you know, as to how much to spend on troops, and then where your bidding points are on each of these properties, is a real important decision point in the game, and you have it every turn coming to you. Now, that can be a huge weapon as well, because you can hit somebody with something, bid on something they can't afford to lose, bid them up and make them spend all their money on that something they can't afford to lose, and then pick off a couple more things. You're only allowed to initiate 3 bids, though, so you don't get that much off of it. You may not. You have to be very careful in your choices there. We saw people lose most of their empire or most of their territory in the bidding situation because they spent too much on troops, but then they can generally get it all back with the troops, because the troops, like I said, are a very potent option. So you have to kind of make a balance between the two. You have to make sure you have enough troops to defend or to gain what you want to gain, but you also have to make sure that you don't take too big a hit, or else all those troops kind of don't do you any good, because the other guy just buys all your properties out from under you. The actual movement in combat is, even though I say troops are really important, it tends to be a fairly minor part of the game for most turns. And then, well, the victory points are in general based, again, on just control and influence. Control provinces are worth a point each, influence are worth a half point each at the end of the game. But each nation has its own goals that it's trying to go for, and those can significantly affect your chances of victory. Some countries, like the Palatinate, who managed to win the game that I was playing, largely because they had a hidden trove of victory points that maybe I wouldn't, that I hope I wouldn't ever allow to happen again if I play it again. Within the game, you also have an optional combat game, a little mini board type thing. It doesn't come into play very often. It doesn't give the same kinds of results as you get off the normal combat. So you pretty much should have to all agree either to always use it in situations where it applies, or just say screw it, it's not worth adding that, and it might create some distaste in your mouth if you're using it anyway, just because the results are different. But it is kind of an interesting little thing. I like little tactical sub-battles. It reminds me of something when we played a campaign game for minis. It reminds me of the same kind of thing. You kind of randomly generate the terrain that you're going to be fighting over. So you don't have a lot of assurance as to what kind of battle you're going to be facing there. Notably, though, the command quality doesn't really impact how the terrain works. The only thing that does impact anything to do with that is the guy with the most cav ends up being able to set up second. And the defender, if neither player has that. So that becomes kind of a slight advantage for cav. In general, cav isn't really that valuable. It's a little better at forced marching. It's better on the battle board, though, because it moves 2 instead of 1. So cav becomes more valuable. Like I said, they're not the same, right? Cav becomes more valuable and more interesting if you're playing with the battle board. Otherwise, though, cav is kind of an iffy proposition, and especially iffy are, well, so here's some place where I think the rules should be changed. Only light cav's allowed to pursue under the rules. And again, you could really make it unpleasant for someone to disengage from battle if you didn't if all cav were allowed to pursue on its normal die roll, and light cav is only able, it gets the bonus that it gets as well, which was it hits on 3s. That would be one thing that I'd change. I wouldn't, in no way do I think that this game is a particularly accurate depiction of the military engagements. Whether you play with the optional or not, it doesn't make a difference there. The endgame victory conditions left me with something of a sour taste. All multiplayer games, or almost all multiplayer games, really do this though, so I can't, point and say, oh, this is just terrible. The truth is that coming up with good endgame conditions for a multiplayer game is very tough. This game manages to fall into one of the many traps, which is essentially because the game ends on a random die roll, and because turn order is randomized, there's a lot of luck in terms of who gets the last turn, which I believe, last action in the turn, the last move conflict, and which I believe is a significant advantage. It depends on who you are, if you have no troops it doesn't matter, but if you have a lot of troops, the guy who gets the last big hit gets a lot of control in terms of being able to score more points at that point. But you don't know for sure, so you don't want to overextend too much. You want to be careful, but the truth just is that whoever gets that last move does have a significant advantage in terms of the territories they can capture. Now, those territories that they capture aren't necessarily particularly valuable. Remember, when you conquer something, it goes into the conquer section, and it becomes worthless to anyone. So you could do as the French did at the end of my game. Rather than split up and weaken your forces, if you think the game's about to end, you can instead simply, destroy another person's victory points by taking territories that are important to them. During the normal play of the game, because there's this sort of cycle of randomness, it's not that big a deal. It feels okay. At the end, if you think, though, that it's going to be the last turn of the game, and you might know it's the last turn of the game on turn 15 or whatever. There is also, though, an automatic victory, and that helps keep people from letting someone get too powerful. It realigns the balance of power in a way that I've got to say it seems to like... Oh, shit. We lost our video there, didn't we? Oh, well. Yep, the crap camera strikes again. In a way that maybe a little bit too fluid for the period under investigation. It's pretty clear, though, that France, for example, or Spain, Spain might have been more willing to allow a Habsburg dominance, but France certainly was not willing to allow anyone a full dominance in Germany. Other powers weren't happy with anyone but themselves having that full dominance. So that kind of balance of power has to be in place. The problem is, as someone starts to steamroll and get close to it, all the alliances just shift in a way too often. What you'd more likely see in the actual 30 Years' War is something like the Habsburgs on a roll and Bavaria withdrawing their support rather than turning against the Habsburgs. France was really the only free player in the game, and they weren't really all that free. They were bound to the one weapon they had, which was Sweden, really. I mean, they used their own troops to fight Spain. The special conditions of the Spanish-French conflict are also very interesting in the game. So basically, there's a lot here that's interesting. It doesn't quite nail down the historical flavor enough for my taste, but there's something different about this game from anything else that I've seen. I don't think it'll appeal to the Euro-style player, even though it's got this kind of bidding mechanism and all that going on. I think it's a little bit too overburdened with special rules and stuff like that for that. And it's not gonna appeal to a lot of your wargamers because it's going to be too light. It's not going to appeal to the wargaming side of a lot of wargamers because it's a little too light, a little bit too loose with the history, essentially. A little bit too free and open. But on the other hand, it does give you something that I don't think exists in too many other places. In terms of topic, there are other games that cover this topic. There's another one called Holy Roman Empire that does, and then there's, I think it's Miranda's 30 Years' War. Maybe I'm conflating the two. Maybe Miranda did the other Holy Roman Empire. I played the other 30 Years' War. It was a less interesting game from my point of view. We'll get to it at some point or another. In terms of catching the historical accuracy and flavor, it's nothing compared to the CDG 30 Years' War, Europe in Agony, or whatever, that I covered early on in my career of bidding things. But, again, there are aspects of this game that are very, very intriguing. That whole bidding versus troops type thing. And you have to kind of, you don't bid for your troops, but you secretly plot your troops because you might not get, you kind of allocate them proportionally, so you might not get everything you thought you were going to get. So that kind of works like the bidding in a different sort of way. So there's a lot of this kind of balance there that you have to keep in mind and everything. And that is very intriguing. So it's definitely something that I would have liked to have played with my old group a couple of times. The more modern players would not cope with this rule book. And they wouldn't cope with me kind of saying, hey, this is how I interpret the rules. They would just say, wow, what a pile of crap this was. The magazine itself, I think I've covered Wargamer magazines before. They've always, I don't know if it's just the typeface being so amateurish, but they've always kind of struck me as such a step below the old S&Ts. On the other hand, the newer S&Ts that I saw from the 90s were a step below. Everything really kind of is. So, again, what is it? It was Against the Odds, I think, put out a pretty decent magazine out of more modern stuff. And I haven't looked at the more modern S&T and decision game stuff, so I can't really speak to what we're seeing now. But, don't feel too excited about the magazine side of it. If you can get just the game, it's the game itself that's kind of interesting. There are play aids, etc. If you do choose to go this route, I would strongly suggest, if this is interesting, to take a shot on the new version instead of trying to fix, and the counters and make play aids and whatever, you're more likely to get a more complete and playable version there, and probably more people will be playing it because this was a fairly, I wouldn't say absolutely, it wasn't a tiny print run, but it's a fairly obscure game in a lot of ways. Wargamer never really had the kind of reach that some of the other companies did. Okay, let's send this up. Sorry about the focus. I knew I should have used the new camera.